For many of us, the Nintendo 64 gave us our first deep dive into the world of three-dimensional gaming, and I think the pioneering spirit infused into its games remains very powerful. But there certainly are some hurdles in the way of revisiting this exciting era of nascent 3D, from getting the N64 looking good on a modern display to challenging emulation and buttons and a stick that don't remap well to modern controllers. At $250 the Analogue 3D and associated $40 8-bit DOE controllers aim to be ready-to-go, no-fuss solutions to those hurdles. And its FPGA-driven hardware emulation even promises potential performance upgrades. So let's find out if it succeeds in replicating or surpassing one of my favorite consoles of all time.
The Analogue 3D finally arrived in November 2025, more than 2 years after its initial announcement. It's entirely possible that the 3D is Analogue's most anticipated hardware ever, for a number of reasons, with it being their first to tout 4K video output being the headline feature. Analogue sent us each a unit along with 4 of the 8-bit DOE controllers to put it through its paces and see how it stacks up. They're not seeing this video ahead of time and had no say in what we could and couldn't include here. Available in either black or white, the Analogue 3D is a slick-looking system that plays to Analogue's usual strengths, a streamlined, gorgeously designed console that plays homage to the original. I do think they could have used a splash of color here, especially being based on a system that went all in on bright, fantastic colors and controllers. The stark black and white feels a bit self-serious for the Nintendo 64. There's always been a bit of a concern whether or not the console will match the renders on the website, and I think in this case, what you see is pretty much what you get. The back of the system has an HDMI 2.0 port, 2 USB Type-A ports, an SD card slot, and USB-C for power. It's about what you'd expect, but that SD card takes a little bit of an effort to get out of the slot. Luckily, the included SD card has a little ridge on it to get your fingernail in there and help you out. Considering that this is Analogue's first foray into 4K video output, it makes sense that the FPGA is quite a bit more powerful. But with that power comes a lot more heat, so much so that the system has a fan inside of it. While it can be heard spinning up when you first plug in the power, depending on where it's located in your setup, how audible it will vary. In my setup, it doesn't call attention to itself at all, while Tri feels that his is at least more noticeable than a PS5 or Xbox Series X. But it's still not that bad. It's entirely possible that this could be a case of it varying from unit to unit. The 4 controller ports in the front allow for standard N64 pads, but like the Analogue Duo, there's also built-in Bluetooth support. Just press that power LED jewel on the front of the system to put it into controller pairing mode, and once connected, a tiny LED lights up on the controller port. At this time, wireless controller support is limited, and Analogue is probably hoping that you'll want to use that new 8-bit DOE N64 pad that was released a few months ago. As someone who tolerates the existing N64 controller, I have to say that the 8-bit DOE controller has gone a long way to make the system a more palatable experience for me, outside of games that make use of an odd controller layout configuration. I had some friends over to play test the controllers, and they liked it too, especially our kids who couldn't wrap their heads around the original N64 controller. So while I lack the experience with the system to truly judge the nuances of it, I've heard that this analog stick here might just be the most accurate analog stick of any N64-centric controller. A major inflection point for just about every other third-party controller designed with the system in mind. I absolutely love it, and Tri even admitted that he likes it a lot, and he almost never likes any N64 controller other than the original. It's also nice that 8-bit DOE controller can wirelessly turn on the console, has a menu shortcut button, and the minus button can be used to hot swap between a virtual rumble pack and the virtual controller pack for saves on the fly. This is especially great for games that use both, like Road Rash 64. Thankfully, the new 3D OS is an evolution of what we've seen on the Pocket and the Duo. While the original Analogue OS was fine on the Pocket, it was clownishly big and ugly on the Duo. Sure, it's still stylistically minimalist, but at least things are more reasonably sized. Inserting a game cart, which can be done while the system is either on or off, will bring up information and a little icon, creating a almost Switch-like appearance, with a lot less color, I suppose. The icons that appear here for us were created by a beta tester and won't be included with the system. But just as with the Pocket, Analogue will publish tools so the community can generate their own artwork. Then you just take that, put it on an SD card, and you should be good to go. Sometimes games will show up as unknown cartridges. In some cases, the pins just might be a bit dirty, and you can use the included cartridge cleaner pads on them. EverDrives and other flash carts, though, will show up as unknown cartridges as well. If you've accumulated a whole bunch of unknown cartridges, you can highlight it and use the Up C button to remove it. Okay, so Try's gonna get to the various menu options and video quality settings here in just a little bit, but I gotta say how much I appreciate that settings can be adjusted on a per game basis. This allows you to tailor your experience to your preferences and relative expectations. Speaking of expectations, I'm just gonna get to the point here and talk about the Donkey Kong-sized gorilla in the room. The revelation of the Analogue 3D being a 4K system carried a certain amount of baggage with it. And we've long been wondering whether or not Analogue was doing enough to manage expectations for what that meant. During the lead up to their previous consoles, their social media would be aflutter with animated GIFs of the games in action. But the 3D had none of this. So many people were left with a lot of unanswered questions or assumptions. Well, those who understand the limitations of hardware emulation knew what the reality would be. But those that didn't might have jumped to the conclusion that games would look like they do in a software emulator on a computer. And, as you probably gathered by now, while the Analogue 3D does output a 4K signal, it still renders games with all the graphical quirks and blemishes that you can expect from the original console. While there are a lot of options to tweak the image quality and system performance, the fact is, this was simply never going to look like an N64 game rendering at a higher internal resolution through a software emulator on the PC, with smoothed out edges, sharper textures and stuff. It's not even going to look anything like the N64 games running on the Switch 1 or Switch 2 apps. If you thought this was going to be the case, I'm really sorry to be the bearer of bad news. It's just that this is not possible with hardware emulation with authenticity in mind. But for those who do love the look of the N64, then you're in for a treat. The original resolution helps the presentation look a lot more cohesive and hides a lot of the graphical blemishes that were meant to be out of sight in the first place. When paired with the system's beefier CRT effects, which is likely the main reason for this being a 4K system in the first place, it all looks exceptionally natural, just like it should. So we don't know why Analogue was so shy to show it in action ahead of time. But on the flip side, it might strike you that the Analogue 3D doesn't offer much of a visual jump for those who already have an N64 with, say, an HDMI mod. Even though they're not 4K, the Ultra HDMI and the PixelFX N64 Digital and RetroGem have been out for several years at this point and offer incredible quality. But what if you've already invested in a 4K upscaler like the RetroTink 4K or the Morph? 4K is no longer an advantage in those situations, and running an analog signal from an N64 into one of those, the difference is fairly minor. And then there's the Mr. FPGA, whose N64 core, which was once thought to be nearly impossible, is incredibly robust with some crazy options. So then, what exactly does the Analogue 3D offer to compete with all of this? For that, I'm going to toss it over to Try so he can get into the nitty-gritty of the settings and see what this thing is really capable of.
The Analogue 3D continues something of a trend that I noticed when reviewing the Analogue Duo. In many ways, you have less granular control compared to Analogue's earlier FPGA consoles, but the video modes have advanced in quality and they've pared down things to the settings that you'd actually want to use. They've made it really hard to screw up and get results that might be considered bad or incorrect. So for the most part, I think they've done a good job of honing the balance between flexibility and usability that should please experts and casual players alike. But there remains room for improvement in a few key areas. One of the greatest conveniences of the display and hardware settings is, ironically, also a bit of an inconvenience, and that would be the per-game settings. In fact, if you hit the R button to move over from the library, you'll see that there are almost no settings that aren't part of your per-game loadout. So for now, just note that we've set 4K output, and we'll revisit this page later. Back in the library, you simply need to hit the right C button to tweak hardware and display settings per game. While it's great that you can set up each game exactly the way you'd like it, you currently can't change the defaults, so it's a bit annoying to have to tweak things for every single newly inserted cartridge. I really would like to see Analogue let us edit the default settings and/or give us the ability to set up something like Custom Override A and Custom Override B profiles that you could launch a game into by pressing a different button combo or something, or just use the settings that you've set for that specific game. I know y'all are eyeing that overclock setting in the hardware section, but first let's go over what's on the display mode page. The default display mode is BVM, with PVM, CRT, scanlines, and clean modes also offered. BVM simulates a high line count professional CRT, PVM simulates a medium line count professional CRT, and CRT is more like the consumer CRT that N64 fans probably grew up with. The RGB masks go a long way to helping sell the look of a real CRT, but the scanlines mode lacks the masks if you don't want that. These aren't necessarily flawless facsimiles, but they're successful in bringing the picture together and conveying the intended vibe. When reducing the output to 1080p, the BVM and PVM modes appear to share a grayscale mask, while the RGB mask on the CRT mode is simplified compared to 4K. I'm impressed, actually, that Analogue tailored the effects to suit each output resolution, with the 1080p results being similar to the Analogue Duo, which is pretty good for 1080p CRT effects. The most fun customization that you can perform with these effects is horizontal and vertical beam convergence. You can choose between off, professional, and consumer. What you're looking for is some red and blue bleeding from the edges and between scan lines. It can be subtle, but it goes a long way in tricking your brain into accepting the CRT effect by simulating the natural misalignment of colors that occurs on real CRTs, even professionally calibrated CRTs. When I first experienced the ability to control this phenomenon on the RetroTink 4K, it immediately became a must-use feature for me. But what's interesting is that you can only control the vertical convergence on the RetroTink 4K. I'm not necessarily saying that I think the Analogue 3D effect is the best here, but I wonder if convergence adjustments could be added to the Pixel FX Morph, or if horizontal convergence could be added to the RetroTink 4K. I especially like how it's not just a straight red goes left, blue goes right kind of thing. Convergence is quote-unquote best near the center, but the colors separate a bit more as they move toward the edges, as they would on a real CRT that could use a tune-up, even if we're relishing the imperfections for effect here. Edge overshoot seems to currently only be toggleable while in the BVM mode, and what it does is sharpen edges of contrast, which I think looks kinda bad, like the velocity modulation that later CRTs often have and enthusiasts like to disconnect internally. This feature seems to be forced on for the PVM and CRT modes, but the impact is usually less severe than seen here, and it doesn't necessarily ruin the appearance. But Analogue has noted my feedback and says that they can absolutely let us turn edge overshoot off on PVM and CRT modes in a firmware update. The edge hardness feature has just two settings, soft and hard. I really can't think of a compelling reason to go for hard edges. A soft horizontal axis is critical for achieving a CRT-like look. The fifth and final display mode is clean, which has a different set of adjustments from the CRT styles. This is what you want to use when going for a pixelated look, and is what we believe works best for general video capture. It's very difficult to know if CRT effects will look decent or horrible depending on the viewer's device or connection, which is one reason why we tend to zoom in when showing CRT effects. Basically, crisp, clean graphics are just a safer bet when sharing gameplay online. The clarity of the clean mode is determined by the interpolation algorithm and sharpness settings. For most N64 games, you can't go wrong with the sharpest setting, which sizes up every pixel with a perfectly hard edge. It's very hard to see the difference in the interpolation algorithms unless you're using one of the softer sharpness settings. So once we're down to soft, well, I don't see any terribly objectionable artifacts with the default BC spline or bilinear settings. But Blackman-Harris and Lankshaus 2 can have more visible ringing artifacts and therefore are not for me. One scenario where you may want to use a softer sharpness setting would be if you're playing a game that runs at a horizontal resolution other than 320. You see, the N64 is almost always outputting 640 on the horizontal, even though games are almost never rendering at that resolution. The deblur toggle, which is over on the hardware page, only works when the game resolution is half of 640, 320. Which tends to be most games most of the time, thus defeating the least desirable contributor to the N64's blurry image. We've had the likes of this in HDMI and RGB mods for original hardware for quite some time now, as shown here with the Ultra HDMI. I'm a big fan of this feature myself. However, deblur seamlessly engages and disengages contextually. So when the horizontal resolution becomes anything other than 320, you're left with these distinct individual skinny pixel cells running across the screen to make up that 640 horizontal output, even though they don't align to whatever the underlying render resolution is. It's not ideal, but that's just how the N64 does things. So while I do like the hard-edged, deblurred 320 pixel wide images, I'd rather see these pixels blended together because they just look odd. And unfortunately, you have to reduce the sharpness all the way down to soft for that blending to really happen. It's not the end of the world, but the result here would be a lot better if vertical and horizontal sharpness could be controlled independently. I've used editing magic to make an example of what that could look like on the right. So I think that would be great, but also in response to some of my upscaling questions and suggestions, Analogue has told me that they're planning to work on a mode that bypasses the N64's final step of converting the internal frame buffer to 640 pixels wide, which should allow any game to be very crisp if desired. Analogue keeps telling us that they've got a whole team on Analogue OS development and are dead set on continuing to develop features for the Analogue 3D and to satisfy power users. Thankfully, though, variable horizontal resolutions are not a concern when using any of the CRT modes, just as they aren't problematic with the smooth analog lines on a real CRT. Gamma transfer is only available in the clean display mode, in tube or modern flavors. Tube looks slightly more washed out, while modern looks a bit darker and richer. I don't know if they're adhering to any actual specific standard, but I've generally just stuck with the default of tube since that general tone suits the N64 era, and especially since many games feature dark settings that are difficult to see in. Even with the brightest in-game setting, it can be very difficult to see in Doom 64, so the tube gamma transfer helps a ton here. Image size and image fit are available for all display modes. Unlike previous analog consoles, you can't do any freeform sizing, but they do give you easy access to the sizings that you'd most likely want to use. Fill sizes up the 240 lines to 9 times their original resolution at 4K or 4.5 times at 1080p. Integer is exactly the same as fill for 4K, but displays the game slightly smaller at 4x for 1080p. Integer Plus is 10x for 4K and 5x for 1080p, cutting off some overscan as a CRT would do while giving you a larger picture. Naturally, the scale factors for 480i screens are a bit different, but generally look evenly sized in all modes. Original fit is what you want almost all the time for the correct aspect ratio, but stretch is great for games like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark that have anamorphic widescreen modes. And cinema zoom is useful for games like Jet Force Gemini, which has a widescreen mode but only in letterboxed form. Something that seems conspicuously missing to me is cropping. It's not a huge deal, but it would be nice for clearing some garbage that would most likely have been left unseen in the overscan of CRT televisions back in the day. Alright, well, that'll do it for the display mode tab. So let's head on over and take a look at the hardware settings that you can tweak for each game, which mostly kinda also has to do with image features. The virtual expansion pack, as you'd expect, connects or disconnects an integrated version of the N64's RAM expansion. As with original hardware, this does not improve graphics or performance except in supported games, but leaving it in the console or on in the menu is rarely problematic. However, you might want to disable it in games where undesirable features are forced when the expansion pack is detected. For instance, when running Resident Evil 2 with an expansion pack, it's totally stupid that some camera angles display in 480i, while others are 240p. What the heck, Capcom? Disabling the virtual expansion pack through the Analogue 3D's per game setting is a lot easier than swapping an expansion pack for a jumper pack on a real N64 just to play Resi 2 in properly uninterrupted 240p. The two games that require the expansion pack, Donkey Kong 64 and Majora's Mask, won't let you toggle this setting, while you aren't even allowed to enable it for Space Station Silicon Valley, which is known to freeze when using the expansion pack. I thought that was a smart touch. Speaking of 480i, you may have noticed during the Resident Evil 2-bit what I think is the Analogue 3D's biggest shortcoming at launch, so I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about how it handles deinterlacing. So, do you love weave deinterlacing? Of course you don't! No one does! But that's what you got here, and there's currently no setting to change the deinterlacing type at all. Even with CRT filters turned on, Weave just makes 480i graphics look terrible. It's tolerable enough for games with 480i menus, but 240p gameplay like Cruisin' Exotica or Top Gear Rally, but Weave deinterlacing is simply unacceptable for optional 480i gameplay modes or the rare forced 480i presentation. Compounding matters, integer plus sizing currently has a bug that causes 480i to have a screen tear in the lower quarter. 480i is broadly uncommon on the N64, but in my book, this is flat out the Analogue 3D's biggest weakness at launch. Low latency motion adaptive deinterlacing, similar to what's on the RetroTink 4K, would be ideal, but even Bob deinterlacing or a similar CRT simulate feature would be far preferable to Weave, especially with CRT effects, since Bob deinterlacing can look pretty much like interlacing on a real CRT. When I asked Analogue about this, they assured me that they're working on a mode that sidesteps interlacing when games are drawn to a 480p frame buffer, as well as motion adaptive deinterlacing for cases where the images are field rendered and unable to be converted to progressive. In the meantime, you can oftentimes avoid 480i modes by disabling the virtual expansion pack in cases where you can't disable 480i in-game. Examples of this include Factor 5's Indiana Jones game and several Star Wars games. We've already gone over deblur for 320 pixel wide games, so let's move on to 32-bit color. What's up with that? Well, I didn't know this, but according to the Analogue 3D manual, the N64's internal rendering begins in 32-bit color, but ends up as 16-bit color for various reasons. This allows 32-bit color to run all the way to the output, with the result being significantly more visible texture detail. I didn't realize how much the color depth was responsible for the N64's infamous soupy appearance, but it almost looks like you've hit the undo button after ill-advisedly using Photoshop's blur tool sporadically around the image, revealing the original clarity. I'm already so used to this feature now that I immediately notice when it's not on. It's not always a straight win though. Sometimes the texture filtering looks a bit weird without the low bit depth smudge. and there can be some unintuitively uneven outcomes in select scenarios, such as here, where the title screen in Mario Golf pops with so much more detail in the grass and trees in 32-bit color, but it also reveals color banding in the underlying image, just as the low quality of the background asset used on the character select screen also becomes more apparent with 32-bit color. Dithering generally becomes less noticeable on the whole, especially on polygon graphics, but in other cases it actually becomes much more visible. I noticed this heavily in Perfect Dark, especially where effects like lights are in clear view. Only you can say whether the upsides are worth the downsides on a case-by-case basis. But for what it's worth, I've generally been using 32-bit color thus far and have rarely felt compelled to turn it off. Reversing that 640 pixel wide output with deblur and reclaiming texture detail with 32-bit color shows what the real ills of the N64 video output are. But oftentimes, people lump these things under the same umbrella as anti-aliasing. I strongly believe that the N64's anti-aliasing was an extremely forward-looking and unique feature for its generation, and is overall a great strength for the system's graphics. But nonetheless, the Analogue 3D allows you to disable anti-aliasing with a hardware toggle if you'd rather see N64 games looking slightly more like PlayStation or Saturn games. Lastly here, and this is the big one, the advanced hardware category may be marked as experimental, but in our 12 days of experience with the Analogue 3D thus far, overclocking seems to rarely be problematic and comes with very tangible performance benefits, although expectations should remain tempered. And I'll re-emphasize, we've only had 12 days with Analogue 3D. Hopefully, people will soon start making spreadsheets listing benefits and issues and the recommended overclocking setting per game. But needless to say, our testing has been more broad than deep with such limited time available before the review embargo lifted. And even if we had more time, a lot of issues would probably take speedrunner level knowledge to detect. But based on my experience thus far, I'm actually quite shocked to say that overclocking seems to be beneficial enough to the point that I'm strongly considering removing my HDMI modded N64 from my living room setup and putting the Analogue 3D in its place. Alongside a Force Original hardware toggle and an auto setting, overclocking has 3 tiers: Enhanced, Enhanced Plus, and Unleashed. According to the Analogue 3D manual, Enhanced improves RAM performance, Enhanced Plus improves RAM performance in addition to overclocking the graphics processing, while Unleashed offers all previous benefits in addition to overclocked CPU performance. So if overclocking the CPU seems to break something, try bumping the overclock down to the next setting so you get just the RAM and GPU benefits, and see if that fixes it. We currently don't know the exact degree of overclocking, but the end result is that games with a 30 frames per second cap hit their target a lot more often, and uncapped games can even hit 60 frames per second. We've generally just been going all out for the Unleashed setting on almost every game we've tested, and have enjoyed the reductions in slowdown and frame drops, having only rarely witnessed anything that would cause us to distrust it or disable it. One of the most satisfying upgrades that I've seen thus far is Gauntlet Legends, which is a relatively high frame rate game for the N64 as it is, but with overclocking it's definitely closer to the 60 FPS target and holds it more often. Now I'm really eager to finally play through this one. It's actually possible for GoldenEye and Perfect Dark to hit 60 FPS for brief moments, and overall performance is much higher, though still generally inconsistent, as they always were. So make no mistake, even with overclocking, having a decent tolerance for time frame fluctuations is still a bit of a prerequisite for enjoying N64 games here, as it always was, but the floor is most certainly raised. I'd say that overclocking doesn't level out performance to quite the same degree as, say, playing choppy PS4 games on PS5 or Switch games on Switch 2, but it still seems like a pretty big win on the whole. And there are quite a lot of instances of games running pretty consistently, especially those that are capped at 30 FPS or have a double buffer setup. For instance, the gameplay in Mystical Ninja starring Goemon appears to hold 30 FPS relatively well. Much better than it does on the original clocks, that's for darn sure. And its pre-title opening sequence has always been able to hit 60 FPS during brief moments, but now it can do so much more often. Quite a lot of popular N64 games have lower 20 FPS caps though, with Wave Race 64 and the Zelda games being perhaps the most prominent examples. Overclocking should at least help with dips below that, but don't expect these games to feel that much more smooth overall. You can hack the cap to hit 30, but this reportedly breaks some things anyway, so I didn't put that much effort into figuring out why my patched Ocarina of Time ROM didn't load up on my EverDrive. In the homebrew software Mario Builder 64, most of the really intense levels designed with PC emulators in mind still run pretty slowly, but are now almost playable, at least compared to attempting them at the original clock speeds or on original hardware. But the point is, you can see that there's a big boost, even if it doesn't get us quite where it needs to be for this player-generated content. I haven't checked out the scene for this game since it came out, so I don't know if there might now be some really cool new levels, but some of the ones that I'd already downloaded can just barely push through to being pretty playable in spots when overclocked on the Analogue 3D. I mean, yeah, of course, software emulation has the potential to push performance even higher, but it is still really amazing to reduce slowdown and frame drops in a hardware environment where you can use your original cartridges. That has a huge appeal for a lot of us. Analogue can't fix deinterlacing soon enough, because look how much overclocking does for Onagai Monsters, which I only bought because I laughed so much at how badly it runs. In all seriousness though, the performance uplift makes some high-res modes actually seem appealing to use now, like in Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. I'd love to replay this in 480i if Analogue can just give us proper deinterlacing, or at least tolerable deinterlacing. While we've become pretty comfortable with the unleashed overclock just working a vast majority of the time, there are absolutely times where overclocking, or at least certain overclocking modes, can cause a game to run too fast or cause other issues. I had a big laugh at the cars in the Beetle Adventure Racing intro driving beyond the point where they're supposed to freeze frame when overclocking. As I said, we haven't had time to play deep into many games while testing overclocking, but I have harnessed my excitement here to begin playing through Space Station Silicon Valley, which has been sitting on my backlog for a long time, and I'm probably almost about halfway through and haven't run into any issues yet. In fact, every time I thought I saw something weird, I went back and checked it on original hardware, and what do you know, it behaves the exact same way. Presumably, the default auto overclock enables one of the overclocking modes that Analogue's testers have verified as seemingly presenting without issues on a per-game basis, or so I'd hope. But unfortunately, it's hard to be sure what auto overclock is doing from game to game. So if you spot a bug caused by overclocking, or if the very practice of overclocking classic games is a bit too impure for you, then simply click the Force Original Hardware toggle and you'll be playing at the original performance level, although more in-depth testing would be needed to verify that that's actually what's going on here. In the coming weeks, you can look forward to a special episode of the DF Retro Super Show, a new video podcast that we co-host with John Linneman and Audie Surley over at the Digital Foundry YouTube channel, in which you'll get to see more in-depth overclocked performance testing with the Analogue 3D, complete with the Digital Foundry graphs and all that. And if you think there are any particular games that have potential for interesting performance boosts, or if you hear about someone else having overclocking or compatibility issues with certain games on the Analogue 3D, let us know in the comments here and we'll test them out if we have time. And that wraps up the hardware page. Region and disabled texture filtering are currently disabled, but are presumably coming. Disabling texture filtering, among many other rendering toggles, are available on the Mister's N64 core. I don't see myself desiring many of these for actual play, but they are interesting as a way to look under the hood, so to speak. Now let's hit R and look at the very few system-wide settings. Here you can only tweak 3 things, at least for now. HDMI mode, which is just resolution and refresh rate, ALLM or auto low latency mode, which isn't really necessary if you've already set up your TV for the lowest latency, and HDR, which you can enable or disable. Most people will just be using 4K 60, but you can also set 1080p and 50 Hz. Setting for 1080p can be helpful if you'd like to downscale the output for a CRT. I used the OSSC Pro's HDMI input alongside its optional analog output module to downscale 1080p from the Analogue 3D to 240p for use on a CRT. Using the clean graphics mode alongside integer sizing, I was able to crop the OSSC Pro input to 1280 by 960 so that everything matches up perfectly line by line at 240p on my PVM. The overclocking performance benefits are especially surreal to see when playing on a CRT. I was very surprised by how well this downscaling experiment turned out, but do keep in mind that the system menu will not be easy to view in this way. And yes, I had to use the OSSC Pro because, unfortunately, Analogue DAC support remains exclusive to the Super NT and Mega SG. It's safe to assume at this point that anyone hoping for DAC support to be patched into the Analogue 3D will end up disappointed, but we'd love for Analogue to prove us wrong on that. It's a bit odd that HDR is simply an on-off toggle, since you really need to calibrate HDR to suit the capabilities of your display. When using HGIG for HDR, it's darker than SDR on my LG C1 OLED TV because I can't calibrate on the Analogue 3D to match my display or my preferences. Oftentimes, HDR can help overcome the darkening effect that comes with scanline and CRT mask effects, not to mention BFI, black frame insertion, for improved motion clarity. But if we review how the screen effects look in SDR, I think the overall brightness has been tuned decently well. It is hard, but doable to reclaim brightness from these effects in SDR, and they've done a bit of that here for sure. I'm satisfied, but I'm not the biggest brightness fiend, so I'm sure these are not bright enough for some folks. At any rate, I'm not expecting to use the ultra basic HDR implementation in its current form unless Analogue grants us some useful controls. More likely, for my general use, I'll be setting up the Analogue 3D to 1080p so that I can pre-scale it through the RetroTink 4K CE anyway and create my own scanline effects and set HDR how I like it there. So yeah, Analogue, please make HDR adjustable. The last item here, sync mode, currently cannot be changed, and Analogue's signature default of 0 delay is enforced. What this means is that the system speed is adjusted so that video is output at 60 Hz even, as opposed to the N64's original 59.83 Hz. I don't think that this is something that pretty much anyone could perceive, but it is a discrepancy that might matter for the legality of speedruns, for instance. Running alongside original hardware, the Analogue 3D will gain 1 second roughly every 5 minutes and 45 seconds. This matches what you see on the right with the unleashed overclock as well, so at least we know that overclocking won't necessarily throw off the game speed under optimal conditions. Honestly though, I do question whether Analogue's penchant for adjusting system speed so that the output syncs evenly to 60 Hz is still necessary. I mean, upscalers these days are totally capable of taking off-spec input and outputting to modern displays with almost no added latency, and triple buffering is often not even necessary to pull it off. I'd love to see Analogue add methods like these in the future that would run the system at the N64's true speed just for the purists. And come to think of it, that would actually be another advantage of DAC support because the DAC allows the Super NT and Mega SG to run at the true SNES and Genesis speeds as well. Oh, and if you've read Analogue spec sheets closely, you might be wondering, where's VRR? Well, it seems that Nintendo wasn't the only one to advertise compatibility with variable refresh rate capable displays this year and end up not delivering on it. I suppose VRR could still be coming in the future, but I do have to wonder if it would even be all that beneficial without 120 Hz for low frame rate compensation. Or I don't know, maybe they just couldn't even figure out how to get it working with N64 games at all. Would that even work? But at the very least, VRR could be another solution for running the system at the original hardware speed. So it would be nice to see it patched in for that reason alone. So maybe VRR is one of the inaccessible sync modes, who knows? Otherwise, for better or worse, those are all of the system level settings. Everything else you can view in here is just informational, menu hotkeys, licenses, etc. I would like the ability to set your own hotkeys because the Ultra HDMI and Pixel FX menu hotkey of RL, D-pad right, and C right tends to interfere with the game less than Start and Z when using original controllers on the Analogue 3D. And at the very least, I think some controller remapping options would be nice, especially for swapping around C buttons for those who struggle to readapt to the tripod-style inverted horizontal and vertical camera controls that were typical in this era. And, you know, some might be surprised by the lack of audio settings, but the N64 doesn't actually have audio hardware. Its sound is all software-driven. So I don't think that's too surprising. But anyway, I'm overall much happier with the console than I expected to be, and will be thrilled with the console if they can come up with some sort of alternative to weave deinterlacing. But that's more than enough of try stuff. So time for me to pass things over to Coury for Coury to do Coury stuff.
All right. As is customary with these types of videos, we're gonna hit this thing with all we got and see what kind of compatibility that it has. We don't have a ton of accessories on hand, and there's nothing scientific about all of this, but we'll see what we can do. So right off the rip, let's get the biggest head scratcher out of the way, EverDrives. Do they work? Well, sorta. It depends on what version you have. Older ones work to an extent. The EverDrive 64 version 2.5 and 3 might need an older firmware for some games to work, lest you get a red screen when booting certain games. There might also be some glitching in the menu when you run the system in Unleashed, but Enhanced Plus and lower largely gets rid of the issues. On the other hand, the current flagship EverDrive 64, the X7, doesn't work at all. Get a black screen. I totally understand that the only thing the Analogue promises is compatibility with original carts, but I'll admit that this one was a surprise, since it's not like the X7 is brand new or anything. It's been out since 2019. Hopefully this will be hastily fixed, either on the 3D OS side or the EverDrive 64 firmware side. Another flash cart that we tested, the 64 drive, seems to run fine. I was also told that beta testers had been heavily using summer carts, so I assume that those work, but we don't have one to confirm. So hey, at least we have some flash cart functionality, so let's check out some odds and ends here. The unreleased beta of Dinosaur Planet runs nicely in widescreen. An enhanced patched version of Ocarina of Time runs at 30 FPS, while cutscenes run at 20 FPS. It's entirely possible that this increase in frame rate might break some things in the game later on though. In that same vein, this patched version of Diddy Kong Racing runs at 30 FPS, and the intro runs at 60. It looks almost surreal. Of course, there's also an enhanced patched version of GoldenEye that runs at a higher frame rate too. Oh, check out this hack of Super Smash Bros. With some extra characters. Heck yeah, it works. One interesting homebrew ROM is the MIPS interface, which displays a series of 4 demos using N64 hardware features that aren't actually used by any commercially released games. The demos seem to generally work with some glitches on the Analogue 3D, but the MI-Repeat demo fails outright. In other words, the Analogue 3D is only replicating the N64 hardware to the extent that it has to, which may put holes in Analogue statements about preservation. I mentioned way earlier in this video about the limited Bluetooth controller support. As it stands as of 3DOS 1.1.0, only the 8BitDo N64 controller and the N64 controller mod kit work, which means that that sweet Nintendo 64 Switch controller is currently out. Hopefully it's not too far off, but for now, if you want to use an authentic style 64 controller, you gotta go wired, or I suppose you could use like a blue retro receiver if you wanted to. Hey, while I have controllers on my mind, I wonder if it's possible to incorporate button remapping at some level. This would be super handy for games that don't translate properly to the 8BitDo N64 controller.
Sharky, watch out behind us!
Let's quickly check out some cheat devices. We tried 2 different versions of the Game Shark, and it was spotty whether or not a game would boot from it. There's a bunch of these out there, so hey, your mileage may vary. We also checked out the European Exploder 64 that was sent to us by MLiG viewer Matthias. It boots up, but the menu seems a bit glitchy. This is hardly surprising, but the transfer pack works just fine and you can play Pokemon through it. However, the deblur does not work on this, so it looks pretty bad. Although it's mentioned in the documentation, I still was pleasantly surprised to see that the system generates per game controller pack saves on the SD card when a game calls for it. So let's see if I can figure out how to dump the saves from my real memory pack and get them working on the 3D. Well, hey, what do you know? It's actually really easy as long as you have a way to dump your save files from a controller pack. I used my SCART cart reader to dump the entire 32 kilobyte .mpk file. From there, you just grab your Analogue 3D SD card, go into the library, find the game, and drop the MPK file in there. And then rename the entire file, including the extension to controller_pack.img. Now, it should be recognized when you load up a relevant game. Other options for dumping controller packs include the built-in dumper utility on the EverDrive 64 and a Dex drive, if you still have some way to use one of those. Ideally though, I'd like to see some way to dump the file on the Analogue 3D itself. Oh, one quick side note here. We ran into an issue with BlastCore, which supports controller packs, but also has on-cart saves. If you have a virtual controller pack inserted, it won't let you access the cart saves. But swapping to a virtual rumble pack causes the game to read that as a defective controller pack, and just locks up. The only way around this would be to remove both, and as of right now, that's not even possible. We have reported this issue to Analogue though, so hopefully this will be fixed soon. So, what do you think? The Analogue 3D is a pretty solid device, even if it's still missing a few features right now. The overclocking potential, in particular, seems to be a serious strong point. But whether or not it meets your expectations after the long lead up, you gotta admit that it's pretty incredible that not even a few years ago, we thought a device like the Analogue 3D was pretty much impossible. But alas, here we are. We think that it'll be improved over time with additional options, and hopefully support for my EverDrive 64 X7 won't be far behind. I am curious what's next for Analogue though. Something PlayStation 1 related perhaps? I guess we'll see.